Well, tonight, this story, the Philippines and Serbia are joining a slew of central banks that are increasing their gold holdings. They follow a global trend of other central banks accumulating bullion in a move seen as a shift away from the U.S. dollar as a standard. This global trend, by the way, was led by Russia and China. So what does it really mean? Well, there are few people who know more about gold than Peter Schiff. And he is good enough to join us now with his take on this. Peter, why are countries doing this? And I guess it bears asking, right? As an American, what does this mean? What does this mean to me? What does it mean for us?
Well, I think it means a lot for Americans because we have enjoyed the extraordinary privilege of being able to create out of thin air the reserve currency. And, you know, before the dollar was the reserve, gold was the reserve. And the reason that the dollar became the reserve is because it was as good as gold, because the dollar was not only backed by gold, but redeemable in gold. In fact, the dollar was gold. It was Federal Reserve notes that were IOUs for dollars, which were made of gold. And we went off the gold standard in 1971, but I think the world is going to go back on it. Because I think the days where the dollar is the reserve currency are numbered, and we're going back to basics. You know, everything old is new again. Gold was money in the past, and it will be money again in the future. And central banks that are smart enough to read that writing on the wall are increasing their gold reserves now.
Well, if we don't have gold and we stay with something like what we have now in the United States, we're then able to manipulate currency in such a way so that we can, for example, print money when we're in the middle of a recession or worse. If we go to the gold standard, for example, if it becomes global and we have to end up accepting it ourselves, that would not be good for us, right? In terms of getting out of these sticky wickets we've been in, like in 2008.
Well, first of all, the only reason we get into those sticky wickets is because of the Federal Reserve. So the Federal Reserve lights the fire and then pretends to put it out. If we go back on the gold standards, we take the matches away from the Fed. So they can't light the fire, so there's nothing to put out. You know, gold and economic freedom go hand in hand. And if you don't believe me, just ask Alan Greenspan, because he authored an article, Gold and Economic Freedom, which I would recommend that people read. But, you know, gold is the enemy of the welfare state and big government. That's why governments don't like gold. They want paper. But the problem is eventually the paper has no value. And we are headed to a currency crisis in the United States. And what's going to put the United States back on a gold standard is to try to stop the free fall of the dollar. You know, they're going to postpone it as long as possible. You know, when Nixon took us off the gold standard, he said it was temporary. He was right. It was temporary, but it just lasted a lot longer than people thought.
Because of what the Dow's done this month, because of what we saw yesterday with the yield on bonds and several other indicators, people are saying that it's not looking like anything other than likely at this point that we will be hit with a recession probably at some point in 2020. In fact, that's what Guggenheim is reporting this morning. Do you agree with that assessment?
Well, not just a recession, the recession. It is going to be worse than the last one, which was the worst one since the Great Depression. We call it the Great Recession. The next one is going to be greater. And what's going to make it that much more problematic, especially here in America, is the resurgence of inflation. This is going to be an inflationary recession. We called it stagflation when it happened in the 1970s, except this is going to be a lot worse. A much weaker economy than the one we had then, and much more inflation, except there is no Jimmy Carter and Paul Volcker waiting at the end of the decade to save us. Instead of going hard right, we're going hard left. We're going to go to modern monetary theory and a democratic socialist, which means they're going to run the presses full steam, and that's what I think is going to crash the dollar, and ultimately, which would bring us back to gold.
Peter Schiff, always a great, always good having you on, and thank you so much for sharing some of your expertise with us on this. Thanks again. I'm Rick Sanchez. You found us on YouTube, and that's awesome. But you know what? I'm also live every night at 7 and 8 p.m. Eastern on DirecTV and Dish and cable and satellite, the RT app, and Pluto TV. I'll see you there.